Absolutely. Well, why don't we just start with a bit about you? What is a futurist, and how do you help organizations embrace change?
Yeah, I kind of actually make a bit of a joke about the fact that when you tell people a futurist, you kind of often get met with these like blank stares. And I kind of imagine what must go through their head. It's almost like they're picturing me in some robes, like huddled over some like crystal ball, and there's some type of magic or mysticism in it. But the reality of it is that there's actually futurism is actually very process driven. So there's often a structure about how we think about the future, and that structure is actually something that you can learn, and it actually gets taught. So I studied as part of a master's program at Curtin University in Western Australia. And I actually worked as a corporate futurist for Rio Tinto for a number of years. So there's a process around it, but I feel like, well, what is it that futurists do? I think that the easiest way of understanding it is that every organization has these big questions and big problems they're trying to solve. And futurism is about trying to find better answers to big problems, helps people think through uncertainty and find different options and different solutions that we might not otherwise have considered.
So, what are the sort of techniques that you use? What are the sort of mindsets that you apply when thinking about the future and how organizations can prepare to it? Is there a process that you go through because it is scientific, as you say?
Yeah, like so I think it's interesting, when you kind of think about practicing futurism on yourself versus actually helping the client with it. Sometimes it's actually easy to help someone else. And one of the reasons for that is that, kind of when you talk to people, one of the requirements of good futures thinking is being willing to explore answer questions that could be uncomfortable. And it's obviously easier to do that for somebody else sometimes than to do it for yourself. But it's kind of having that as a precondition that we need to be willing to explore uncomfortable questions is probably one of the things that's really, from a mindset perspective, is super important. What I'd also add to that, though, is that the future is a great place to explore uncomfortable questions. So, in some ways, if you think about it, the future is hypothetical. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. So, we can talk about these in terms of maybes and mights, as opposed to when we talk about sometimes confronting questions in the present, it's much harder to do that because people kind of see it as having this immediate impact on themselves. So, I kind of actually think that, when we kind of, so from a mindset perspective, you've got to be okay with being uncomfortable. But the caveat to that is that the future is a great place to do so.
And it sounds like from what you're saying that it's not always about identifying opportunities for the future, but it could be uncovering risks potentially of what's coming down the road and how to mitigate them and proactively head them off. Is that what you mean by the uncomfortable conversations?
Yeah, so sometimes, and I'd give an example. I was working with a client recently that is involved in stonemasonry, and there's obviously a very, very well-known challenge at the moment around silicosis, where basically the silica dust from the stone that gets ground ends up in the lungs and almost creates cement in the lungs. But one of the problems they face is that a lot of the stonemasons don't want to go and get tested for silicosis because they don't want to know the answer. They don't want to hear that not only could they actually be really unwell, they also don't want to hear that this could be the end of their business. They don't want to know that this actually also could be not just their business, but also potentially their identity at stake. And so what we find is people don't want to know the answers, and so they're not actually willing to explore the questions properly. And I think the same type of thing, the head in the sand type thinking happens in a whole bunch of different organizations. I think, though, sometimes that when we do open ourselves up to exploring those questions, we can find different strategic options that we might not have previously considered. So, part of futurism is actually imagining alternate ways that the future could play out and then using that as a catalyst for conversations internally and almost like, or even individual contemplation. But if this was to unfold, what would we do? We're not saying that it will happen, but often we find these options, these strategic options and ideas that don't just fit one possible future, they actually fit multiple possible futures. So we find it as a way of, first of all, as you said, uncovering risks that we might not have previously considered, but also finding opportunities that we also hadn't thought about previously. And then actually having genuine strategic options that we could go away and pursue. I think about the power of optionality is really, really important in times of uncertainty. So if you're like from a strategic perspective, if we operate in a fairly stable environment, then we kind of generally know what our customer wants, and the competitive advantage comes from being able to do that one thing much faster and cheaper than other people can. So we focus on productivity. But in times of uncertainty, that can actually come back to bite us. Because when we get really, really good at one thing, we become less good at other things. So we actually start to reduce our flexibility and our adaptability. So I'd actually say that in times of uncertainty, what we actually want from a strategic intent is to be able to be flexible and have options or optionality. So we pursue multiple things simultaneously. And at the right time, when we need to make the decision, we choose what we need to do and we then do it. And we can shift and change the strategic direction as we need because we have both the mental and perhaps the operational flexibility to do so.
And that's very interesting because if you have a look at some of the bigger organizations around today, there are organizations that were born or grew significantly through things like recessions because it gives a unique opportunity for things like mergers and acquisitions, for growth, for new mindsets, uncovering new parts. I think it's in Chinese, the word for opportunity is the same for word for crisis, right? And it sounds like the organizations that can perceive change as a good thing and see these opportunities, generally weather storms better or sometimes even come out better.
100%. I think there's definitely a strategic advantage in being able to be more flexible and adaptable than your competitors can. So if you kind of take that as a perspective, I think that's almost that, yeah, in times of crisis, the people who can adapt and respond well do better. So if you can actually build that into your DNA as an organization, both, as I said, at a strategic level, but also at an operational level, so we can think and process new ideas, but then we can also act on them, then as you said, a crisis is actually a great opportunity.
Mm. And it's interesting because well, I'm a data scientist, and for me, numbers are easy, people are difficult. And I'm guessing for a lot of organizations, there's a balance because there'll be people that want to change, and there's people that would be adverse to change who think that they're changing too quickly. And how do organizations navigate that well when there's a diversity of different perspectives about how important change is?
Yeah, I think when you talk about like people are adverse to change or some people are adverse to change, I think we can definitely set conditions for better change and worse change. So if I get no say in it and no input into it, and I don't understand why it's happening, then obviously I'm going to find change super challenging. But one of the kind of the premises of future thinking is that it should be a collaborative approach, that we actually want to take multiple perspectives from across the organization and use that into shaping the strategic options that we identify. Now, if I've been actively involved and I've seen the different way the futures could pan out, and then I'm faced with some strategic choices or decisions that get made within the organization that impact me and I'm required to change, then I've got a really strong contextual understanding of that change. And that's far more easy for me to buy into than if I just had that change dictated to me without any kind of context or understanding around it.
And when we talk about change, it's a very versatile term. People automatically switch to this big transformational change, where sometimes it's the continuous improvement model that goes better on the other end. Is this something I can see you smiling?
Oh,
You
it reminds me
agree,
exactly back
disagree?
when I was last at Adapt. I
Yeah.
reckon 2018 or 19, I was doing some content around that particular thing. Around it's not, yeah, like the truth of it is that in almost all circumstances, transformation sucks, but we can actually handle lots of little changes really well. So there's certainly things around both the preparation and then the enactment of change that can definitely make a massive difference. Kind of like secretly, and I know there's a whole profession out there would probably disagree, but as soon as you need to involve a change matter in change, like it's a red flag to say, has this change actually been designed well? Like, why do we need to manage people? Are people actually, what makes them feel that they're going to have to be supported? Is it clear about what the context is and why we're doing the change? So I think people change in their own lives all the time. If you look back on your own life 10 years ago, whether it be from work or professional, you actually probably know there's some significant differences between what you're doing now and what you were doing back then. And you've done all those changes all by yourself. And, so it's like there's certainly something that says it's not that we're adverse to change wholesale. There's something about the context and the design of that change that really matters.
It's interesting because you're talking about incremental changes, talking about cross functionality. My mind automatically jumps to things like DevOps or DevSecOps, where you have people across different teams working in an agile sort of way to solve business problems. How do you scale that concept across the business? How do you connect people who have potential solutions to potential problems to implement continuous improvement and change?
Yeah, so there's a few different kind of, I suppose, improvement methodologies, I think, that share a similar, like, philosophical underpinning. And agile, and my background was in lean. I think lean and agile have very similar philosophical underpinnings, which is very people centric in terms of the change, and it prefers small incremental changes, lots of small incremental changes over big irregular ones. I would suggest that the biggest barrier to lean or agile or any of those methodologies taking place is whether it's actually buying at a leadership executive level into them. Because if you're trying to enact that type of change or that type of philosophy of change at an operational level, yet at the top we keep making these massive wholesale changes, that disconnect makes it almost impossible for this to become the way we do things around here. Like, that high level impact on the cultural norms of an organization is almost impossible to ignore. So if you want it at an operational level, it has to be enacted, first of all, at an executive level.
And you can have at the executive layer sometimes a barrier to change, a barrier to try new things and adopt new technologies, which is where you get the shadow IT component where people will go out and they'll actively use the tools that they need, but it comes with a contextualized risk to it. And sometimes, that risk isn't inherent to the person, it's more inherent to the business, especially from concept of security or people now using generative AI, things like intellectual property. So how do we empower people to innovate, but within the right context?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I don't know if there's necessarily an easy answer to it. I do, like, if you kind of go, I'm an optimistic person. I do believe that most people actually, when they go to work, operate from an intent of trying to do their jobs better. And if we believe that to be true, even when we look at things like shadow IT, we actually see it's somebody just trying to get the job done. So I think we've got to, first of all, seek that the objective isn't necessarily to then regulate and punish that. We've got to find a way of actually encapsulating that energy. I mean, there's actually a real positive energy around what is actually maybe considered a negative behavior. But how do we capture that energy and channel it into something we can actually use? So we've got to find systems and processes internally that allow people to enact that intent in a positive way. And I think the challenge is that we don't really understand, like how many different barriers there are to positive behavior in large organizations. So, even I think when we talk about things like KPIs and budgets, you know, KPIs and budgets are measures that can actually severely hamper positive intent. I mean, the classic example when you look at, for instance, like, we have when we look at a budget for IT, effectively what we do then is we assess projects based on their cost and not their value. There's no budget for value, there's only a budget for the cost. And so suddenly good ideas aren't getting enacted because the cost is there, but the value has never actually been calculated. And again, we can actually have KPIs for individuals or for teams that seem to be aligned with the organizational vision, but often actually have a negative consequence. In one of my keynotes, I talk about the idea that, we talk about the idea that what gets measured gets done, but I would actually argue in the short term, what gets measured gets gained, and in the long term, what gets measured gets automated. And the problem is, when it comes to the automation of things that we measure, is often we're measuring the wrong things, and therefore we automate the wrong things. Years ago, I did a keynote for hairdressers, and there was some work done by Oxford University back around 2014. And at the time, hairdressers were one of the professions that was considered least at risk to automation in the world. And I reckon one of the reasons why that is true is because we can't actually know what a good haircut is. Can't measure a good haircut. Now, if the only thing that defined a good haircut was how many haircuts we could do per hour, we could automate the hell out of that thing. There would be this vacuum thing that lifts up their hair and it'd go chop and you'd be done and next person in and, it'd be done so quickly, but everyone would have, well, that's a pretty average haircut. But the fact that we can't measure what good looks like and feels like, then we actually can't automate it. So I think that's a really interesting thing about KPIs and measurements is, and we game them and we automate them, but often they aren't actually the things that we're really seeking from an organizational or even perhaps a societal level.
That is so interesting, and it's a really good way to put it with the hairdresser. From a business context, I think about how do you put a price on employee engagement? How do you put a dollar figure in terms of investment on the experience or how enabled a person feels or their ability to tie their everyday work to the goals of the organization? I think that linking behaviors to outcomes piece is particularly important for how organizations view things like change and progress.
Yeah, 100%. I think when, like this is you mentioned earlier on that, you find the numbers easy and the people hard. And I think part of that is there's a complexity around humanity. There's a complexity around the value that people bring to the workplace that is not easily quantifiable uh, in numbers, let alone in money. So we pay them in money. That bit's pretty clear. We know what they cost, but we struggle to be able to articulate what value they bring. Now, there's certain productive output that they generate, which in turn could result in revenue generation for the organization. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff they could do that severely impacts that, either for better or for worse. They could be a really helpful person that's constantly doing little bits and pieces to support the output of their colleagues. Or alternatively, they could be doing little things to constantly undermine their colleagues. Both of those have a dramatic impact on the value or the revenue generation of the organization, but really, really difficult for us to measure. So I think that, again, I think that sometimes we almost have to get to a point where we go, the numbers maybe enable us to have a qualitative conversation. So the quantitative can enable a qualitative, but we shouldn't necessarily should be making decisions just on the quantitative information alone. We need to understand the limitations of that. And I think even again, taking it back to the concept of futures thinking, there's only ever data of whatever happened in the past. We have no data on the future. So all data is historical. So it's useful up until a point, but it also has its limitations because every decision we make based on that data will only pan out in the future. So you have this point in the moment, like in the present, where the data of the past meets the decisions of the future. And within that, we've got to be able to acknowledge the limitations that the data provides or the limitations on that decision making that the data can support.
What do you see as the current risks of AI and generative AI? Do you see it as something that's going to destroy us all? Some people think, well, I'll give you my point of view first.
Yeah.
Some people think that it's going to make us stupider, but I've been using it. I used it the other day to help me with an Excel formula that was just giving me such a headache. And I'm a good data scientist. I should be able to do an Excel formula. But from what it spat out, I have the prior knowledge to understand it, understand the context and why it gave me that solution. And actually, I think it made me smarter. But is this going to be the death of intelligence? Is there some risk with generative AI?
So there's certainly some risk and there's certainly some opportunity. And notwithstanding, I think a really, poorly understood challenge around things like copyright that has not been resolved and really will need to be resolved, and the ownership of individuals, people, data that's being currently used to train the large language model. So let's put that a bit to a side for a second and just talk about it purely from the perspective of use. And the way I describe it is that these type of generative AI systems, as they're designed, they're not actually designed to give you the best answer. They're actually designed to give you the most average answer. So what is the best, most likely word to go next in this sentence or this phrase? Like that is exactly what they're designed to do. And what that means is they're actually designed to give you entirely average answers. Now, there's certain things that we may be really good at. Like you might be really good at certain aspects of data science, in which case it's likely that if you were to ask ChatGPT or another generative AI platform to answer a question, that you could have actually done better yourself. But we're not above average at everything. In fact, there's a whole bunch of stuff, even within our field of expertise, that we may be below average at, in which case the generative AI model could actually generate a response that helps us. I think so on both, if we were to rely on it, and we're really good at something, it could actually give us something that's dumber. And then also, if we were really poor at something, it could give something that's better. So it can do both of those things simultaneously. But the second part, and probably the deeper part of that question, when we talk about people being dumber, is actually making people lazier and people not checking the work. There was a really interesting case recently where a lawyer in the US used ChatGPT to inquire around case law to do with a case that he was submitting, and ChatGPT actually made up some case law that didn't actually exist. He submitted that to the judge as precedent, and it was still his reputation on the line. Now, what actually happened there? And you go, well, probably he should have checked it. It didn't actually make him dumber. It just made him look dumber in a way. So I think that one of the things we haven't come to terms with yet is that, first of all, it may not always be true. And there's actually a significant amount of work that needs to go into checking the validity of the information that we're getting. And that takes effort and that takes time. There is no free lunch in this case. So we may do less work up front, but we may have to do more work later on to actually validate the information that we're getting. I also kind of partly go, though, like there are certain aspects of our work where it could turn out that these types of generative AI models are better at what we do than we currently do. And that's okay. This has actually happened throughout human history. We've created tools or technologies that do certain aspects and certain tasks better than us. It's okay. We need to learn it. We need to embrace it. And through that learning, we also need to understand where our competitive advantage lies. It may be that sometimes what we're better at is eliciting the right questions as opposed to finding the right answers. And that in itself is hugely valuable if we can actually understand where we sit in the process of kind of value and knowledge creation.
It's really interesting. And look, we're almost out of time, and you're an incredible thinker for what's coming up. You've got a process behind it. And from this conversation, I also get the feeling that you're an optimist. So is there something that you're particularly optimistic about in the future? Is there something that you see which is going to come into fruition that's going to change the game or really accelerate how we view work?
Yeah, I was listening to this podcast the other day, which I found really interesting, where it talked about that I think within every human being, there's this conflict. There's a conflict between what we think and what we feel. So when we actually think through stuff, we often go, God, this is hard. Don't know how we're going to survive this. Generative AI is going to ruin the world. But then somewhere in what we feel is we always feel hope. We always feel like things could get better. And that is enough in some ways to keep us going. I look around, and on one hand, I feel like that too. Like, I go, gosh, there's so much complexity and so much uncertainty. It's a really tough time, I think, especially for organizational leaders right now, is how do you make good decisions? How do you set good strategy into those conditions? But I also have the hope and the belief that, there's something about kind of like the human experience or the collective human experience that drives us forward. Like, we cannot help but feel a sense of connection to the people around us, whether they be our colleagues, our neighbors, the mums and dads at the school, our extended family. There is a connection between us as humans that I really think ultimately is the bit which will drive us forward and find a collectively better future for all of us.